before we ride into today's story. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all across the country. The Arizona Territory in the late 1870s was a place where silence carried further than words. A small cabin stood at the edge of dry land, half hidden by cottonwoods, with its rough-hewn door marked by years of sun and wind. Inside lived Elias Carter, a weathered cowboy past 40, his frame lean, his face worn by trail dust and quiet regret. Once he had worked cattle drives and fought in skirmishes no one spoke about anymore. But now his days narrowed into simple survival, patching fences, tending a horse too old for range work, cooking beans in a blackened pot. He lived apart from town, apart from people, not because he hated them, but because the way of his past had taught him that distance was safer for him and for others. On that evening, after a day spent clearing a section of down rail, Elias returned to his cabin with a mind as tired as his body. He was ready for nothing more than water from the bucket and a plate of cold bread. But when he reached the door, his hand froze on a latch. A figure leaned against the frame. A woman. She was Apache, her dress torn, dust ground into every seam, her face carrying bruises too fresh to hide. Her eyes darted between him and the tree lean, tense, mistrustful, as if ready to bolt, even while her legs trembled with exhaustion. She looked like she had run farther than her body was built to carry, and she was holding on by will alone. Elias felt his jaw tighten, a knot forming in his chest. He knew what it meant for an Apache woman to arrive alone, at night, bruised and desperate. Trouble had already touched her, and trouble would follow. He had a choice. He could turn her away and keep his life simple the way he had fought to keep it. But as he looked at her, her cracked lips, the faint tremor in her hands, the guarded defiance in her eyes, he knew she wouldn't survive the night out there. And despite everything he had lost, despite his vow to keep to himself, Elias couldn't bring himself to close the door on someone barely holding on to life. He stepped aside without speaking, pushing the door wider. His decision came wordlessly, a quiet acceptance of risk. He knew it could cost him. Still, he gave her the space to walk inside. Her name, though he didn't know it yet, was Ayanna. She had been born in a small Apache band south of the Gila River, but captivity and harsh winters had stripped her life bare. For months, she had been moved from one place to another, labor traded for scraps, promises of safety broken again and again. When she finally escaped, she carried nothing with her except the will to keep walking. By the time she reached Elias's cabin, she was out of options. She hesitated at the doorway, her chest rising with sharp breaths. She studied him as carefully as he had studied her, searching his face for cruelty or deceit. All she found was a man who stood still, waiting. When he offered her his coat, faded wool with patched sleeves, her eyes narrowed. She didn't trust it, didn't trust him. But the cold on her skin won the argument, and she pulled it tight around her shoulders without a word. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and iron. A small fire still burned in the stove, throwing enough heat to fight back the night chill. Elias hung his rifle on the wall, deliberately slow, so she could see it was no longer in his hands. He didn't approach her, didn't try to ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he filled a tin pot with water, sat on the stove, and placed a clean rag on the table within her reach. His way of saying, "You can tend your wounds yourself, and I won't interfere." She remained standing for a long while, her back near the hearth. Her breathing stayed uneven, like each inhale was a decision. Elias let her decide when to move. Finally, she glanced at him, waiting for permission to sit. He gave a small nod toward the chair. Only then did she lower herself into it, the coat drawn close, her eyes still sharp on him, as if testing every movement he made. For Elias, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. He had lived with silence for years. It was his only company. But now it was different. He was aware of every sound. The crackle of the fire, the creak of the chair as she shifted, the faint rasp of her breath. His thoughts turned over and over. Who had hurt her? Would they come looking? Was he prepared to defend her? He knew the answer before the questions even finished forming. If anyone came, he would stand between her and them. He wasn't sure why yet. Maybe because no one had stood between him and lost before. That mattered. That night, neither of them spoke much. He poured her water, softened bread and broth, and pushed the bowl across the table. She accepted, though her hand shook, where her eyes closed briefly. He realized it wasn't only hunger that weakened her. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had carried fear too long. When sleep came, it came uneven. Elias lay on the bed near the wall, facing the door with a rifle under the frame. Ayanna remained in the chair by the fire, boots still on, her hand resting close to the armrest as if ready to spring awake. Both of them kept their distance. Both of them rested with caution. But for the first time in many nights, neither was alone. The fire burned low in the stove when Elias stirred awake, his eyes opening to the faint orange glow and the steady sound of the wind pressing against the walls. For a brief moment, he thought he was alone again, the way most mornings had begun for years. But then he saw the figure still in the chair. Ayanna had not moved far during the night. Her head rested against the wood, chin tilted down, arms folded under the coat he had given her. She had not loosened her boots, nor had she let go of her guarded posture. Sleep had claimed her, but it had not softened her weariness. Elias sat up slowly, listening to the creak of the bed frame, making sure not to startle her. In his mind, a quiet weight turned over. She had trusted him enough to stay inside, but not enough to lay her body down where she might feel unprotected. He understood trust was not something freely given. It was tested and earned, and he had done nothing yet but keep her alive for one night. He rose, lit the lamp, and checked the door. The bar was still in place, the latch secure. Outside, dawn was only a pale line on the horizon. He poured water into a basin, the sound drawing her awake. Her eyes opened sharp like an animal prepared to flee. But when she saw it was only him, her shoulders eased a fraction. "You slept," Elias said quietly. His voice was calm, even the tone of a man who did not want to force a reply. She straightened, pulling the coat tighter. "Not much," she answered after a pause. Her voice was low, roughened by fatigue, but steady enough. Elias nodded once, not pressing her further. He set a pot on the stove, spooned in coffee grounds, and waited. The silence between them was not empty, but tense, full of questions neither of them had yet asked. He felt them building. Who was she running from? How long had she been out there? Why had she come this way? But he pushed them aside. Questions could wait. Food and warmth could not. He set bread to soften in broth again, this time adding a strip of dried venison. The smell began to fill the cabin, rich enough to remind them both that survival was more than just breathing. When he placed the bowl in front of her, she looked at it for a long moment before taking the spoon. She ate slowly, as though her stomach did not yet believe it would be fed. Elias watched her hands, shake less with each bite. Only after she finished did she speak again. "Your name?" "Elias Carter," he said. "Yours?" "Ayanna." She gave nothing more at first, just that one word, her eyes watching his reaction. He inclined his head. It was not a name he had heard often, but it settled on the air with a weight that told him it mattered. He repeated it once under his breath, not questioning its meaning, only anchoring it in his mind. The morning stretched slow, marked by small choices that built the framework of how they would share space. Elias fetched water from the barrel and left the dipper where she could reach it. She washed her hands and face in the basin without asking. He set tools on the table to mend a leather strap, making his work visible so she could see what his hands were doing. She kept near the fire, her eyes often drifting to the window, as if expecting riders on the horizon. It was then that the unanswered questions from the night before began to press harder, not only for him, but for her as well. She asked suddenly, her voice sharp with the edge of fear, "Is anyone else here?" "No," Elias said, meeting her eyes. "Just me." "Do others come?" she pressed. "Not unless they want work or trouble," he answered. His voice was steady, but he felt the weight of her suspicion. She was measuring not just the truth of his words, but whether he would protect her if trouble came. Her shoulders loosened slightly, but the fear didn't vanish. It told Elias enough. She was not just running. She was hiding. He didn't press her for details. If she wanted to tell him, she would. For now, survival came first. Later that morning, when he stepped outside to tend the horse. He caught himself listening more carefully to the sounds of the land, the shuffle of branches, the creak of the fence. He knew the cabin was no longer only his refuge. By letting her in, he had changed its purpose. He felt the weight of that choice settling on his shoulders, but not with regret. It had been the right decision, even if it pulled him back into a world of danger he had sworn off. Inside, Ayanna moved a window, peering out with careful eyes. She traced the edges of the room as though trying to understand how it might serve as a defense if anyone came. Her mind, Elias knew, was still in survival. She did not relax. She did not trust, but she stayed. As noon drew closer, Elias finally broke the quiet. You'll need medicine for those bruises. The store in town has some 3 miles west. Her brow furrowed. Town. Yes, he said. Small. Sheriff keeps order more or less. You won't have to speak to anyone if you don't want. She thought for a long time before nodding. Then, tomorrow, not today. Elias gave another small nod. He understood. One day at a time. That night, the fire burned steadier than the night before. And though Ayanna still chose a chair by the hearth, her breathing eased sooner. Elias watched her eyes close, her hand falling away from the armrest. She still carried fear, but it was no longer the sharp, cutting fear of a hunted animal. It was a tired fear of someone beginning, against their will, to trust. Elias laid back on his bed, the rifle still within reach, his thoughts heavy but calm. He did not know what she carried in her past, or what kind of men might follow her trail. But he knew this much. He had given her shelter once, and he would do it again if it came to that. Whatever her reason for being here, it had already become his reason, too. The next morning began with a pale sky stretched thin across the desert, the kind of light that gave no warmth yet made every shadow sharp. Elias stepped outside first, pulling the door shut, quietly behind him, and stood on the porch, listening. The land was still. The only sound was the scrape of the horse shifting in the corral, and the faint trickle of water moving through the creek bed half a mile away. He had learned long ago to read mornings carefully. A quiet morning meant the day could hold anything. When he returned inside, Ayanna was awake, sitting on the edge of the chair with the coat draped over her shoulders. Her eyes moved around the cabin, as if memorizing every board, every exit, every object that could be turned into a weapon or shield. Elias noticed her boots were still on, the laces tightened. She had not slept in a way that allowed rest. She had slept in a way that allowed survival. He set a basin of water on the bench outside and left her to use it. When she stepped out a moment later, she flinched at the brightness, but she bent over the basin and washed her face and arms, the water turning brown as it dripped from her skin. Elias kept his distance, sitting on a stump near the corral and running a leather strap through his hands, fixing a buckle that cracked. He worked with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted her to see his hands busy with something ordinary. As she dried her face with a strip of cloth, she looked around the clearing. For the first time, her eyes softened, not with trust, not yet, but with the recognition that this place was more than 4 walls. It had land around it, a corral, a tree-line, and a man who kept it standing. It looked like a home, though the word might not have been one she was ready to use. Elias finally spoke. I'll need to go into town. There's Sal there. Better food than what I've got left. Ayanna's brow tightened. Town. How far? 3 miles west. Not far, but folks talk. If you don't want to be seen, you can wait at the cottonwood outside the flats. She considered that, arms crossed tightly under the coat. Her instinct was to keep moving, never staying in one place long enough for someone to find her. But she had walked too far, lost too much strength. The thought of returning to the road alone made her stomach twist. I'll wait, she said finally, but only until the sun moves past that tree. She pointed toward the cottonwood, her voice steady, but layered with caution. Elias gave a short nod. That's enough. Before they left, he gave her a small piece of jerky and filled a canteen for her. He did not ask if she had money, family, or anyone waiting for her. He could feel the questions on the edge of his tongue, but he swallowed them. Pushing would only close her off more. What mattered now was keeping her alive and keeping attention away from the cabin. They set out together. Elias led, his rifle strapped over his shoulder, his steps measured so she could follow without strain. Ayanna walked behind, silent, except for the crunch of her boots on dry earth. Her eyes swept the horizon constantly, not as a curious traveler, but as someone who expected danger to rise out of ground itself. She carried herself as though one wrong sound would send her running again. When they reached the cottonwood, Elias stopped. He pointed to the shade under the wide branches. "Wait here. I won't be long." Ayanna hesitated, studying the open land around them. She hated the thought of being left in the open, but the tree offered cover and water lay not far beyond. She pressed her back against the bark, keeping her view wide. "Go," she said. Her voice clipped, but her hand gripped the canteen tight, betraying the weight of the choice she was making. To stay, to wait, to rely on someone else's return. Elias started toward town, each step pulling him closer to the noise and questions he had avoided for months. Ayanna stayed behind, leaning against the cottonwood, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Her hand still gripped the canteen, her fingers tight around the leather, betraying the unease inside her. Her mind raced through possibilities. Every step Elias took away from her increased the risk, but for the first time in months, her legs ached in a way that made it impossible to run. The journey had drained her strength, and there was nowhere left to go but forward. Elias, for his part, didn't look back. He knew the road to town would not be long, but the distance between the two of them felt immense. He wondered if she would still be here when he returned, or she would have vanished, gone as quickly as she had appeared at his door. He couldn't blame her if she did. The ride to town was uneventful, and the closer he got, the more Elias felt a weight pressing on his chest. Town had always felt like a place to hide from, a reminder of everything he had lost. But this time, there was something else. Ayanna was not just a stranger he had taken in out of pity or obligation. She had become something more, someone he had begun to feel responsible for. When he reached town, the dust kicked up under his horse's hooves. The streets were quiet, the buildings looking weathered and worn, as if they too had endured years of hardship. Elias passed by the saloon, his eyes briefly catching the gaze of a few familiar faces. But he didn't stop. He didn't need anything from them, and he certainly didn't want to offer them anything to gossip about. He headed straight for the general store, his mind focused on the task at hand. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the clerk looked up from behind the counter. His glasses slid down his nose as he studied Elias. "Back again, Carter?" the clerk asked, his voice laced with mild curiosity. Elias nodded curtly. "Just a few things. Salve, gauze, soap, flour. Coffee." The clerk didn't ask any questions. Elias was known for his business being his own, and it suited everyone just fine. As he gathered his supplies, his mind returned to the cabin and Ayanna. What was she doing now? Was she still at the cottonwood? Or had she moved on? The thought of her waiting, alone, gnawed at him. "Anything else you need?" the clerk asked, his eyes now flicking to Elias's saddlebag, noticing it was more empty than full. "No," Elias replied, paying with coins that clinked softly as they exchanged hands. He took the goods and left the store without a second glance. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than the ride into town. Elias's thoughts tangled in knots. The riders who had come by the cabin, the questions the sheriff had asked, and now Ayanna. What if they were still out there, watching? What if trouble had already found its way here? What if Ayanna was forced to leave again, running further than before? When he finally reached the cottonwood, the shade beneath the tree was still empty. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of movement. Elias's heart sank in his chest, and for a moment he feared the worst. Had she run again? Had she chosen the road over the safety he had tried to offer? But then he heard the soft crunch of boots on dry earth, and there she was. Ayanna stood in the distance, near the cabin's edge, watching him approach. Her face, usually tight with suspicion, was now calm, her gaze steady. "You stayed," Elias said, his voice quiet with a mixture of relief and surprise. Ayanna nodded once, her eyes not leaving his. "I'm not sure why," she replied, her voice steady but low, as if she were testing the truth of her own words. Maybe because I knew you'd come back. Elias looked at her for a long moment, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. He had tried to distance himself from the world, from people, but now he knew that wasn't an option anymore. Not for him, not for her. Whatever path they were on now, they would walk it together, whether they liked it or not. "Let's get back to the cabin," he said, his voice calm but firm. They walked back in silence, Ayanna slightly behind him, her eyes scanning the horizon. Elias didn't ask if she had seen anything. He didn't need to. He could see it in her posture, the way she carried herself with a quiet readiness, like someone who was always waiting for the next threat to come, the same way he had carried himself for years. When they reached the cabin, the door creaked open slowly. Elias stepped inside first, setting the supplies down on the table. Ayanna followed, her eyes flicking to every corner of the room, as if looking for a way out. Elias could sense the tension in her. He knew it wasn't just the men in town she was worried about. It was a fear that followed her all her life, the kind of fear that never really left, no matter how many days passed. They spent the evening in quiet routine. Elias prepared the fire, and Ayanna helped set the table, her movements careful, deliberate. Neither of them spoke much, but in the shared silence, there was a growing understanding between them. As night fell and the firelight danced across their faces, Ayanna took a seat by the hearth, her hands resting on her lap. Elias sat across from her, his mind still turning over the events of the day. He could feel the tension in the room, but he also felt something else, something he hadn't expected, the beginnings of trust. He didn't know where it would lead or if it would last, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Ayanna met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for something. Elias couldn't tell what she was looking for, but he didn't look away. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he would protect her as best he could. He had made that choice when he first opened the door. After a long pause, Ayanna spoke again, her voice soft. "What happens now?" Elias sighed, his gaze drifting to the fire. "We wait," he said simply. "We wait and see what comes next." For once, waiting didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice to stay, to stand, to be present in a way neither of them had ever been before. The fire flickered low as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin. The quiet between them now felt different, like a fragile thread weaving them together. Elias sat by the hearth, his eyes never leaving Ayanna. She had pulled the coat around her shoulders again, but her gaze no longer darted to every corner of the room. She had settled into her place. As if for the first time in months, she could relax just a little bit. Elias had always kept to himself. A solitary man with too much lost, too many memories of wars fought and families buried. He had lived for years with only his own thoughts to keep him company. But now, as he watched Ayanna in the firelight, he felt the weight of something else, something he hadn't expected. A bond was beginning to form, slow but undeniable. She wasn't a prisoner here, not anymore. The walls around her were not just wood and stone, but of her own choosing. The night stretched on, and the sound of fire crackling was the only noise that filled the cabin. Ayanna had settled in the chair again, her eyes half-lidded, but still sharp. She hadn't said much since returning from town, but Elias knew that the quiet between them had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something both of them had spent so long running from. Then, as the warmth of fire reached its peak, Ayanna stood up abruptly, her hands tight around the coat's edges. Elias looked up, startled by the movement. She moved toward the center of the room, and his heart skipped. What was she doing? For a brief moment, he thought she might be reaching for something, maybe even to defend herself. The tension in the room thickened as she moved slowly, deliberately, but then she stopped right in front of him, her chest rising and falling with a deep breath. Her eyes held his, searching for something in his face. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low, measured, but with an edge that made Elias' pulse quicken. "Are we alone here, Elias?" she asked again, her words deliberate, the question loaded with more than just a need for assurance. The firelight flickered across her face as she stood in front of him, no longer the guarded, fearful woman he had first met, but someone more open, more real. Something about the way she asked the question made his chest tighten. It was as if she needed to know, not just if anyone else was around, but if he, too, was still hiding something. "Yes," Elias replied, his voice steady, though his heart was beating faster than he cared to admit. "Just us." Ayana's eyes softened, just a fraction, but her hand still gripped the coat tightly around her. It was clear now that she wasn't just seeking reassurance. She was asking for something else. For permission, for understanding. The distance between them had been closing slowly, but this felt like a line they were about to cross. For a moment, she hesitated. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached for the ties of her dress. Elias froze. His heart thudded louder in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he certainly hadn't expected this. Ayana wasn't looking at him with seduction or intention. No, this wasn't about that. With slow movements, her fingers worked at the ties of the dirt-streaked dress, the fabric falling away for her shoulders. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The dress, torn and stained on the brutal road she had walked, was being shed, not to reveal the soft skin beneath, but to release the weight of everything she had carried. The fear, the shame, the desperation. She was shedding a part of her past, and with it, a piece of herself. Her skin was marked by bruises, remnant of a past she couldn't escape, but she moved with a quiet dignity as the torn dress fell to the floor. She didn't look at him as she undressed. She didn't need to. It wasn't about him. It was about her, about reclaiming something that had been taken from her over and over. Elias sat there motionless, not out of shock, but respect. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire, but his mind raced. This wasn't just an act of vulnerability. It was an act of reclaiming power. Power she had lost in the hands of men who took her, but now she was taking it back, piece by piece. When she was finished, she reached for the basin of water and began washing, scrubbing the grime and the blood of the road from her face and neck. Elias stayed still, his back straight as a rod. He didn't turn away, but he didn't intrude either. This was her moment, and for the first time since she'd come into his life, Elias realized just how much courage it took for her to stand there like that, vulnerable, unguarded, yet still unbroken. The silence in the room grew thicker. He could hear the sound of her breath, steady now, as the water washed over her. It was a small, intimate act. There was nothing sexual about it, only survival and reclamation. When she was done, she wrapped the coat back around her shoulders, covering herself, but there was a change in her, a sense of power, quiet but undeniable. Her eyes met his, and this time there was no fear in them, only trust, only acceptance. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, Elias felt the final thread of doubt unravel. She wasn't just a woman on the run. She was someone who had fought and survived, just like him. She had chosen him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and somehow that made all the difference. She sat back down by the fire, her body finally relaxed, her posture softer. Elias finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. "You're safe here," he said, his words carrying the promise of the life they were beginning to build, not in silence, but in shared strength. Ayana nodded once, the smallest of movements, but it was enough. Enough to let him know that she believed him. For the first time, the cabin felt like home, not just to Elias, but to both of them. The fire in the hearth burned lower, the warmth casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the sharp, dry scent of sagebrush and dust. Inside, the silence between them was no longer just a weight of unspoken words. It was a quiet understanding, a space filled with something unspoken but real. Elias sat across from Ayana, his boots stretched out toward the hearth. She sat near the fire, her coat still draped over her shoulders, but now her eyes, once full of suspicion, held something different. There was a softness there, but also a quiet strength. She had made herself vulnerable in a way no one else had seen, but she had also reclaimed a part of herself that had been taken, by the men who pursued her, by the land that had tried to swallow her whole. Elias studied her for a moment, feeling the weight of their shared silence. His thoughts drifted to the moment she had shed that dress, that torn, blood-stained fabric. It had been more than just a removal of clothing. It had been the shedding of her past, of the things she had carried for too long. And as she sat there now, wrapped in the coat he had given her, Elias couldn't help but feel a deep, unspoken connection between them. They were both survivors, both marked by the land, by the violence and the heartbreak that came with it. But now, in this small, humble cabin, they had found a moment of peace. And yet, the question still lingered. Elias had always been a man who kept his distance from others, a man who had lost everything he ever cared for. He had lived alone for years, thinking it was safer that way. But now, with Ayanna here in his cabin, the land that had once felt so empty now felt full of hope, full of possibility. Ayanna, too, felt the shift. She had come to his cabin, bruised and broken, seeking refuge. But now, sitting before him, the air between them felt charged like the calm before a storm. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to offer her not just shelter, but something deeper, something more real than just survival. She looked at him then, her gaze steady and sure. There was no fear in her eyes now, just a quiet question. It was a question he could see in the way she held herself, in the way she had shed her past, and was now looking toward the future. He knew the storm inside her hadn't passed. She was still running, still haunted by the men who had claimed her, who had tried to break her. But in that moment, he knew that she had found something in him, something she hadn't expected, something she wasn't sure she was ready to trust. But Elias had already made his decision. He had opened the door to her once, and now he would stand with her, not just as a man offering protection, but as someone who, in the quiet of the night, had found something he had thought lost forever, someone who understood the weight of loss, of survival, and of the strength that came from standing together. He stood then, slowly moving toward her, the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders, but the future bright in his eyes. Ayanna didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes met his. They both knew what was about to happen. The space between them was no longer filled with suspicion or fear. It was filled with the weight of everything they had shared, the quiet moments, the unspoken words, the trust they had begun to build. Elias reached out, his hand gently brushing against her shoulder, pulling her closer, not with force but with quiet understanding. Ayanna didn't resist. She didn't pull away. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of the world on her shoulders. She let herself feel the heat of his hand, the steadiness of his touch. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him. She could feel the storm inside her, the fear, the hesitation. But there was something else there now, something stronger. Without a word, Elias leaned down, his lips finding hers in a soft, hesitant kiss. It wasn't a kiss of desperation, of need. It was a kiss of connection, a kiss that spoke of shared pain, shared survival, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be truly seen by another. And as their lips met, the fire in the hearth burned brighter, casting a warm glow across the cabin, as if the land itself was blessing the moment. Ayanna's hand moved to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. She could feel the weight of the world still pressing on her, but for the first time in years, she felt something else, something lighter. She felt safe. She felt wanted. Elias pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. But all he saw was trust, soft, fragile trust that had taken root between them. "Stay," he whispered, his voice hoarse but firm. "You don't have to run anymore." And for the first time, Ayanna believed him. She had been running for so long, but now, in this small cabin with Elias, she didn't have to run anymore. She didn't have to hide. "Stay," she whispered back, her voice trembling but full of something new, something hopeful. They stood there for a long moment, the world outside forgotten, the fire crackling between them. They didn't need to say more. In that moment, everything had been said. Elias led her to the cot, and they lay down together, side by side, the warmth of the fire mingling with the warmth of their bodies. Outside, the wind howled, the land wild and untamed. But inside, in the quiet of the cabin, they had found something rare on the frontier, a love born of survival, of shared pain, and of the quiet choice to trust. The next morning, The sun rose over the desert in a blaze of gold. Elias and Ayanna woke, not with the urgency of the past, but with the calm of two people who had chosen each other. They didn't know what the future held, or what challenges would come, but they knew this, together, they could face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Ayanna smiled, her heart light, her soul free. As the sun rose higher, Elias stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, the land harsh and unforgiving, stretched out before them. But in that moment, they weren't just two people surviving. They were two people choosing to live together, and that was enough. The story didn't end with flight or fear. It ended with trust, with a promise, with two people who had once lost everything, now standing side by side, ready to face whatever came next together.